Welcome back, everyone. My name is Amanda Griffiths, and I'm your co-host for the final session this afternoon. I hope you've all managed to engage with each other through the networking, the exhibition area, and made some good contacts. Our exhibitors are delighted to see so many of you this afternoon, and they wanted us to remind you that the final session, they will hang around afterwards and they will be there to meet you. Our final session today is FIDIC contracts. In the final session, we will be discussing FIDIC contracts with particular focus on construction contracts and MDB construction contracts and EPC turnkey contracts. The session today will be chaired by my co-host, Phil Laycock, and I'm delighted to welcome the following speakers. Charles Wilsoncroft, partner at HKA, Ignacio Palacios, who's the Senior Contracts Manager at Suez International Treatment Infrastructure, and we will be joined by Luca Puletti from Ghella Spa. So I'm going to hand you over to Phil.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Apologies for the slightly late start where we will be going. We had a few technical issues and we're still waiting for Luca, but I'm confident that Luca will be able to join us shortly. My colleagues are just working on him behind the scenes. So as before, if you listen to the earlier contacts, we are going to first and foremost hear from Charles, who's going to introduce the session. And then, as usual, we will go to you at times for questions. So if you could utilize the chat function down the right-hand side, and we'll pick up from there. So, Charles, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you, Amanda. And most of all, thank you to all of you guys who have managed to stay on the course for the day. Appreciate there's a fair bit of contractual talk going on. And I've been listening all day and I've certainly found it very, very interesting. Some real insights from industry. So I think it's been really worthwhile. And hopefully we'll get some more gems, some nuggets out of this discussion as well. And again, apologies for the late start. It was entirely my fault. I've got no idea what happened or indeed how I fixed it, but here we are. So hopefully we're all good to go. Of course, as we all know, the stresses and strains experienced in the UK construction sector due to COVID, the current situation, have also been seen worldwide. And as has already been touched upon in some of the earlier conversations, not just international contracts, because that's what FIDICs tend to be dealt with, or contracts with an international aspect. Of course, contracts across the UK, many things we have that are imported from places like China and places like Italy, places that were significantly impacted by the COVID crisis, that then therefore have a knock-on effect. But as you probably appreciate, most FIDIC formal contracts tend to be of an even more international bent. They might be international contractors, certain international suppliers, and carried out under international jurisdictions by perhaps British companies. So, of course, the issues that we've seen in the UK have been prevalent around the world, and obviously there are interactions across all forms of contracting, construction or otherwise. Just another thing, like a thread I'd like to run through the discussion, is that obviously all the focus at the moment is on COVID, and the recovery from COVID, and we'll obviously discuss the CLC document and what have you in a bit. But I'd like to just also reflect and say, well, one of the issues we have in the UK construction sector is that, frankly, the sector wasn't in particularly rude health in the run-up to the COVID crisis. And I think that we can actually utilise what's happening now as a bit of a catalyst, take into account lessons learned from the 10 years running up to what we've just experienced and what we're experiencing now, adding to what we're dealing with at the moment, and really come out with a more sustainable, robust contracting sector. So that's something I'd like to discuss a little bit, and perhaps maybe some of the questions will draw that out as we go. And just to give you a quick background on myself, I'm a partner in HKA. I used to work for a contractor, civils contractor, and a UK-based client organisation. But for the last 10 years, I've been working for HKA, or Knowles as was, effectively working with clients and contractors, both in dealing with disputes and contentious matters, but also on an advisory basis to try and do my little bit to form a slightly better way to work, a slightly better way to contract. So I'm very interested to see what Luca, when he joins us, and Ignacio say in respect of their interests and their interactions with the FIDIC contract as well. So,
thank you, Charles. Ignacio, let's start with you. You have the floor now. It's Luca's not here, but as I say, we're working on it. Tell us what COVID-19 has how it's impacted on Suez, and in the context of FIDIC contracts. What are some of the challenges that you face at the moment?
Well, I believe the COVID-19 has impacted everybody's life, and FIDIC is nothing different. So it is obvious that all our projects have been impacted massively for this big issue. Depending on the jurisdiction, currently I work mainly in Latin America, Asia, and Europe. There are areas where the impact has been higher than others. We can see projects which have been suspended, workers who cannot go to site, clients who are running out of money, so contractors who probably go bust. So yeah, it's a major issue internationally, and I think it is no different. So that's like the situation it is at the moment. Anyhow, I believe that there is room for optimism because projects are coming back somehow to normality. There are claims, but at the moment we can see also that there is goodwill for both parties, for clients and from contractors, to try to get rid of this situation, to forget about it, and to carry on and try to come back to life.
Mm. So the interesting thing that's come out of this morning's discussion, so we talked about JCT and we've talked about NEC. Both of these contracts are dealing with COVID-19 very differently. So Charles, you're here as the FIDIC expert. So what's your interpretation of the way that COVID-19 has impacted on international projects that are using the FIDIC form of contract?
Well, yeah, I mean, as Ignacio said, contracts worldwide have been impacted, and the thing about FIDIC, for those of you who don't know, it's very much the most worldwide used standard form of contract across many different sectors. So there's an awful lot of discussion, there's an awful lot of commentary, and there's an awful lot of usage and opinion on it. And actually, under FIDIC, there's actually quite a few different ways and mechanisms whereby the effects and impacts of COVID-19 and the push and effects come out of that can be dealt with if, of course, the standard forms are not changed. There are various ways. I mean, generally, there is a force majeure clause, as you're possibly aware, that deals with unforeseeable, uncontrollable events, parties that would have been unreasonable for either party to have accounted for in their risk or in their pricing, and indeed that either party could have avoided. Now, interestingly, the force majeure provision within the FIDIC contract also has a provision that neither party could either avoid, which I think it's fair to say it's not possible to avoid the effects of COVID-19, but also not possible to overcome. And what we are seeing is some discussion, and I think what we find is that, and again, as lots of people alluded to, I know Veronica Flint-Williams was a very enlightened employer that she was discussing earlier. And as Ignacio says, there are lots of examples whereby contractors and employers are working together to get through this process. But the fact is we live in a world where we have a whole range of contractors and a whole range of employers and a whole range of ways in which people see risk. And there are already discussions being had whereby employers are saying, well, okay, maybe this thing will have happened, maybe it has impacted you, but by putting in certain measures, say, for example, social distancing measures on site, mitigating the ability to get materials from one place or another. So actually, you are, as a contractor, able to mitigate and overcome the effects of COVID-19. So therefore, it doesn't fall into a force majeure event. Interestingly, well, not necessarily so interestingly, but under FIDIC, the force majeure entitles you to time and not cost if it's not one of the listed events, which I think it's pretty well accepted that COVID-19 isn't one of the listed events in FIDIC. And there are also other areas where you're entitled to potential for time. So, for example, you have delays by authorities, which is a lot broader in scope. So if you have, say, for example, in the UK, we've been talking about the site operating procedures and the government's guidance that they should be upheld. Previous people have talked in the past that it's not a change in law per se, but it's guidance, it's advice, it's strongly suggested, let's say, by the UK government, in which case you could argue, certainly probably pretty well, under clause 8.5, that would actually be a delay by the authorities, which goes to, you know, if any authority procedures disrupt work. Also, you've got the change provision. Just in some jurisdictions, you might have a change in law, an actual change in legislation, and in other countries, say, for example, in England and Wales, or certainly in England, sorry, we didn't have a change in law per se. Now, interestingly, the 1999 version of FIDIC, which is probably still the most utilised versions of, just defined law as being statutes, regulations, legislation. But the 2017 versions of FIDIC, which are much more proactive and much more collaborative, include definitions of decrees, orders, rules within the definition of law. So in which case, it's very possible that a change in law under the newer version of FIDIC would actually come to light and come to pass in respect to COVID, which also entitles you to time and cost. So from that aspect, contractors are reasonably well protected in the standard FIDIC forms.
That's a pretty good summary there, Charles. Thank you of that. Ignacio, I sort of wanted to ask you really, question one was do you consider COVID-19 to be a force majeure event? Now, Charles has said that in general terms, FIDIC doesn't sort of recognise force majeure, but there seems to be different interpretations and clauses in that. But are we saying in simple terms that it's not classed as a force majeure event?
Well, in my opinion, first, there are two subjects to look at: the COVID as itself and the consequences of the COVID. So first is to know whether the COVID is a force majeure event. In my opinion, it depends, because one of the key points is whether it is unforeseeable or not. In the projects which are currently at execution, yes, it may be unforeseeable, but in future projects, it may not be unforeseeable, because we are all aware of this issue. So this is just a message for these people who are preparing tenders. They should take that into account, that maybe remedies that you've got at execution currently, you will lose those entitlements, because that key point, that key test, which is the foreseeability, you are going to lose it. So this is a message for estimators. Very, very important message. So that's why I'm saying it depends. Whether it falls under the force majeure, I think it is debatable. But in my opinion, I would say yes. It depends, obviously, in the amendments, the contract, and the jurisdiction. But for me, complies with the tests. It is unforeseeable. Is nobody's party's fault. So it may fall. And the only remedy, as Charles said, is an extension of time. There is another factor to take into account, which is the disposal of duties, which is a very important part of this clause of force majeure that can stop performance some of your duties. And by not performing those duties, you are not in breach of contract. So it's one of the key points of the notification and clause 19th. You can explore also other clauses such as employers' risks, because in fact there is one part which says pandemic. So, well, it's not pandemic, is force of nature, so it may be considered like a force of nature. So those two clauses are interesting to look at as to the COVID as itself. Apart from that, you've got the consequences when then you've got a set of clauses, as Charles mentioned already, delays caused by authorities in case, for example, the governments cannot allow you to work. You've got also unforeseeable shortages in availability of personnel or goods caused by epidemic. So I think it complies with the test under FIDIC. Other which are maybe not very, very clear, it might be 2.1, which is a very interesting one, which is lack of access to site, which instead of giving you time, it gives you money, but not only your costs, but the profit. So from the contractor's perspective, that clause could be very, very interesting, if applicable. Adjustment for changes in legislation, it is important as well because you can recover money and time. So I think currently FIDIC it is quite balanced. Obviously, it depends on the amendments because I haven't seen any pure FIDIC contract. It's always amended. So some of these entitlements may have been removed already. So it's something to look at. Also, how this has been implemented by, for example, you cannot claim change in law if the government has not officialized that change. So that's an important key, how things have been formalized. That's a key point as well. So at the moment, yes, the entitlements are there. Whether you can apply them or not, it's a different story.
I think just adding on that point as well, or expanding on that point, I'm very interested in respect of the conversation around unforeseeability going forwards, because, of course, we've been in this contracting world for quite a long time, done this sort of thing for a very long time, but nothing quite like COVID has ever happened before. It's happened now. Obviously, there's a risk that there will be bounce back in respect of or a recurrence, let's say, another peak from the current situation. But of course, there's also the chance that, COVID could go away and in 5 years' time, there'll be something completely new. But I wonder how we can determine or deem that something like springing up completely on again would necessarily fall into that box of being foreseeable just because something's happened before. Because if we look at, say, force majeure clause, it includes, say, acts of God, kind of earthquakes, that sort of thing. And of course, earthquakes have happened before and earthquakes will happen again. Obviously, in certain jurisdictions, certain countries, certain geographical regions, there is more chance than that than others. But I just think there's going to be an awful lot of discussion, also a lot of consideration in respect of how risk is assessed, managed, and priced and shared between the parties in respect of this aspect of, well, just because it's happened now, does it mean it's foreseeable in 5 years' time? And I think there's an awful lot of discussion that's going to come out of that. But certainly in respect to the current circumstance, yeah, absolutely unforeseeable, I would say in any case.
Personally, as a bit of a layman, I am surprised that COVID-19 isn't covered by force majeure, but suspect that future drafts of this contract will include this going forward. I mean, it sounds like this any sensible contracts will have something that relates to a pandemic in it going forward. Is that likely to happen, Ignacio?
I think to some interpretation it is covered currently, and the force majeure event, the force majeure clause. Whether it is convenient or not, whether to include it within this clause, considering that the contractor is going to obtain just an extension of time, it may be risky as well, and it may unbalance the contract. obviously from the client's perspective, I believe it might be good news from the client's perspective, because it is quite reasonable just to provide time when a situation like this appears. So it is a balancing act exercise. I believe from now on, one of the big difference the COVID may cause is the improvement of the negotiations at bidding stage, because it is such a risky element that you need to really sit down with your employer and to see how the risk is going to be distributed and allocated. And it is just for the best of the project, just to sit down. Maybe it can be 50-50. I will not ask for all the costs, but you have to pay me some at least, or nothing, or what. I think you should open the door for negotiations for the best of the project. In my case, we work as an employer at the SPV level. We work as a contractor at CPC level. So I'm involved in both worlds. And I think the improvement of negotiation, it may help.
So, Charles, Chris Jones has asked a question here. You can sort of see it down the right-hand side. So Chris has been busy all day, actually. So thanks for your contribution again, Chris. In the UK jurisdiction, would the entitlement to profit be superseded by PPN, in your opinion, Charles?
Sorry, PPN?
PPN. You see, that's with the analogy there, Chris. Very quickly type in what you mean by PPN. I was assuming you would know what that is. So so he then moves on. Is the entitlement,
which is cost and overhead which is cost and overhead only. Yeah. Well, lack of ultimately your entitlement under 2.1, which is entitlement to cost plus reasonable profit, is enshrined in the contract. So irrespective of UK jurisdiction, if you are working under a FIDIC contract and it's unamended and it has the clause 2.1 in it, and bear in mind the issue of access to site 2.1 is that the employer does not provide access to or use of part of the site as required under the contract, so in accordance with the planning. So what that means is that it's the employer who's not provided you access. So in other words, it's kind of a breach of contract by the employer by stopping you go to site. That's not necessarily the same as you not being able to go to site as a contractor because the government has shut the site down. If the employer, and this is the situation we're seeing quite a lot, whereby employers, understandably, are saying, well, we're not actually stopping you go to site. We're not going to be in a position where we're going to say, don't come to site. But if you're going to take the decision, main contractor, to not come to site, and certainly in England, that's very much been driven by the contractor taking a view on their protection of their staff, issues with supplies, issue with materials being delivered, issue with subcontractors being able to supply labour, etc., all the while having to socially distance and keep those kind of measures and controls in place. Well, main contractors are taking that view. But it's a pretty rare thing. I appreciate it happened in Sellafield, but I don't think there are many employers who are turning around and actually saying to the main contractors, no, you're not going to come to site, we're going to shut it down. And in which case, I think you'd be much harder pressed as a contractor to be able to pursue a claim under clause 2.1, because ultimately it's not in the employer's ability to, or it's in their ability, but they're not actually saying don't come to site. So in which case, in that instance, I think probably 2.1 wouldn't come into play in any event. But if it did, and if the employer did stop you coming onto site as a result of, well, actually for any reason, because it's just the employer's default under the contract, then in principle you'd be entitled to your cost and reasonable profit.
So, bearing in mind that we've sort of established that different countries are handling COVID-19 in different ways, different laws, different legislations, different support packages there. Ignacio, how is this going to affect international contracting going forward, particularly where there will be multiple countries involved in a particular scheme. What's this going to do to the form of contract going forward? Will presumably the form of contract will override everything, but it's going to have a bearing on how people will assess the risk when it comes to negotiating these contracts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think eventually what this is going to cause is an improvement in negotiations for the rest of the project. Risk allocation is one of the key points when entering into a contract. We can see a lot of companies who have lost a lot. So that's going to be implemented somehow in their internal policy before entering in any contract. As a result, probably the clients will have there will be less appetite from contractors to get into tough contracts. There may be, on the other hand, other contractors who are desperate, who need the cash flow, which is again risky for the employer. So what I think this situation is going to create is the improvement of negotiations, and thus a better probably allocation of the risks. So amendments, again, if the employer is too protected, he will not get good contractors, competent contractors, because what competent contractor is going to take all the risk of a situation like COVID? And on the other hand, if the main contract is too weak, the employer is unprotected. So the key is just a good balance contract between both parties and for the best of the project. So that's what I think the situation should end up. It should end in that. That should be the final outcome of this issue.
So, Charles, does HKA kind of have a consensus here? Because you guys work all over the world. Be interested to see what your different offices feel about this.
Yeah, of course. I mean, one of the things you need to bear in mind is that not just different jurisdictions, but it's a fact that you have cultural differences around the world, and different people from different parts of the world deal with each other differently. Have a different view on how risk is to be managed. They have a different view on dealing with contentious matters or issues that might go to claim. Some countries, some jurisdictions are more litigious than others, dare I say, without getting into the nuance of that. And that will always factor and shape how these things work as well. What I would say is I absolutely 100% agree with what Ignacio was saying, in that there should be, and I believe that there's a real opportunity to drive a better form of construction sector, a better form of contracting, dealing with proper, effective, proactive, upfront risk management, which is something that's very lacking generally. It's starting to get a bit of traction, but there's still a long way to go. Kind of very grown-up, mature attitude to risk. And unfortunately, sometimes you get personalities that come in and pull that back to something a bit more traditional. And it's difficult to pull away from that. And again, that can change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction as well. And I think that there's the real opportunity to have much more of a drive towards kind of collaboration, alliance in contracts, partnership contracts, which is got a fair bit of traction in the UK, starting to pick up, and other, in Australia and that kind of place there, they're really pushing forward with that sort of thing, and better value procurement. But I just worry, and just coming back to a point that Ignacio said, without trying to labour it too much, I do worry that what can happen in this sort of situation is that you will have contractors who, lots have gone out of business already, lots were going out of business before COVID, and have the mindset that to keep their skills, to keep the resources, to keep the businesses going, they need revenue. So to drive revenue, they end up buying projects with the aim of trying to turn a profit on them, but without building that into it effectively, not properly appreciating the risk maybe, which then has, it becomes a race to the bottom. And I think Mark mentioned this in the talk before about the risk of getting a race to the bottom. And it's the sort of thing that unless you proactively push against it, I think it's a natural state to get into. So that's why there has to be positive drivers, and this is worldwide, region-wide, and it has to ultimately be driven initially by employers and probably funders as well, to try and say, well, no, we need to drive to make sure this spiral to the bottom doesn't happen, because that's what I'm very concerned about happening. And UK, we're worse for it than anyone else, I would say.
So, forgive me if you've seen me on my phone, because I'm trying to communicate with Luca, who seems to have made it onto the system. But Luca, I need you to try and turn your webcam and audio on and join us backstage. So wherever you've logged in, Luca, if you can open another window and click on the same link, and hopefully you can get on, and we can throw all these awkward questions at you for the last 15 minutes of the talk. So fingers crossed on that. But while we do, I'm going to pick a few questions off the side. We have a question from Emilio. What's the role of insurers in the present and future similar situations? Yeah, they're going to have a significant interest in this, aren't they, Ignacio, in terms of how this is resolved?
Yeah, well, currently they haven't. Well, it's just from my experience, haven't helped much. Because this type of risk was not covered, so that is the situation at the moment. It's just, I think, every company in the world are experiencing problems with this. I don't know what the insurance will do in the future regarding this risk, but given the enforceability and what may happen, for example, if there is a second wave, it may be quite risky. But my honest question is, I don't know. I don't know what the insurance are going to do in the future.
Luca, hi. Can you hear us?
I beg your pardon. Disaster. I struggled for 1 hour. I can see you not. I cannot speak.
Okay.
I have heard part of your discussion. I don't want, if you want me to share my view.
We would very much like you to share your view, and thank you very much for your persistence.
No, I mean, I'm very
So the question, Luca, is we'd like to hear your view on FIDIC form of contract in the context of COVID-19 and how it's an issue for you.
Thank you. I apologize again. Anyhow, I've heard what the speaker before me have said, and they have made a very clear and thorough explanation of all the FIDIC clause. So maybe I will turn to the experience of my company in the contract that we are undertaking. And by the way, not all the contracts stopped by the COVID-19. For the FIDIC contract, I have to say that the clause that we try to apply most was obviously changing law, because as has been said up to now, force majeure does not really cover you, providing only extension of time. And employer were inclined to provide you with extension of time. So we find any possible way to grab change of legislation clause. Although I do agree that the change in legislation, the present FIDIC, I'm not talking about 2017, is not fully cover any act of the government, but I mean, we mainly convince the clients and the employers that this was the case. And this gave us a certain protection. In one occasion, we worked the other way around. There was not a clear change in law, but because of the state of alert of the country, the engineer instructed us to comply with the alert situation of the country. And in that case, I think this was a nice idea. We construed that as a constructive change. In that case, it was a constructive suspension, meaning that we all know what is a constructive change, not a formal instruction to change, but an act of the employer leading to a change. So we said that in the instruction that they gave us to comply with the COVID alert situation was equal to a suspension of works. And as everybody knows, in accordance with the clause 8.9 and 10, you are entitled to cost and time. So that was, in one case, a more conflictual case, the contractual solution that we applied for. And then there was a step back, and then we agreed that was a change in legislation at the end. So that was the most complicated case. In principle, I have to say openly that the attitude of the client was not so negative, especially in terms of direct cost for COVID-19. Social distancing, equipment, mask protection, anti-contagious protocol. That was a kind of, we are still struggling. We are still discussing, but there is an attitude to insert in most of the site, not all the sites that really have an impact, but in some sites there is an attitude to recognize this direct cost. In one case, we even appoint an independent expert to assess time and one independent expert to assess cost. One was HKA, by the way. And there was, as I said, this kind of attitude that helped us. What instead is a really big question mark is for the future, for instance, or even for in the site where we have a suspension of work. Again, there is a certain attitude, we are still discussing, but there is an attitude to recognize, let's say, the suspension cost. We even put forward, including time-related costs. Now, the big issue is for the future, because when we started, as we have started in most of the site, in all of the site, when we recommence the work, the risk is for the future, the loss of productivity for the future. That is a big question mark. That is a big question mark because, really that it's an unknown question. Because I think this will really change the attitude of, the method state of doing the work. As in the past, the tunnel were excavated very fast, but unfortunately people was dying because of sickness deriving from the excavation, the gas, and so on. Now I think we really have we have to a certain extent to re-establish a different method statement for tunneling work, for instance, especially tunneling work, because obviously the social distancing, the people having access to the track or the system to remove the earthwork and so has reduced the progress of work at least of 10-15%. And this is a big question mark because this we will request this indemnification, but it's really unclear if the client will be inclined to recognize that. And this is also affect the present ongoing tender because there are ongoing tender on which there is an attitude for the client to recognize direct cost, or alternative, you can put we can put the direct cost in terms of anti-contagious measure, protection measure. This is easy to a certain extent, easy to assess. What is very difficult to assess is the impact on productivity, which can be a big cost. This will last for 1 year. 1 year of COVID maybe is equal to 10% productivity, I'll make an example, and then we can calculate that. But if COVID-19 effects are going to last for more, this will be another impact on production, on productivity rate. So that is a big question mark in which we are still struggling. And even, for instance, in tender, we are struggling. Ongoing tender to be submitted, and equally in the contract, because we have restarted the work, and for the past there is an ongoing discussion. For the future, there will be ongoing discussion. We even put forward, obviously, the claim, but we didn't receive any feedback on that.
So can we just look at sort of future amendments? Haley Drever has posted a question there. Throughout the day, there's been a few mentions about future amendments to contracts, both the JCT, NEC, as well as FIDIC. So given, her point is that given the last major global pandemic was over 100 years ago, 1918, I think, I'm not sure we can correct you on that, Haley, so we'll assume you're right. Do the panel think that future pandemic clauses, and I'll go to you, Ignacio, first. Do you think that future pandemic clauses will become a permanent addition, or just...
Unfortunately, I think this should be.
Luca, can I go to Ignacio first? Sorry to interrupt. Ignacio, can you pick that up first?
Yes, FIDIC, the latest suite is very new. It's from 2017. So I cannot envisage any modification of the contracts. It's something that it should be done by the compilers of the contract. I mean, FIDIC allows to make amendments, to make special conditions. So these special conditions should cover the current situation, but immediately I cannot see any change, because the latest version, for example, from the Yellow Book, it was 1999. The current version is 2017, so I cannot see any immediate changes in a near future. As I said, that should be covered by the drafters of the contract, the compilers of the contracts.
Okay, thank you. Charles, do you want to comment on that? And then is there anything specifically that you want to bring Luca in that we've already touched before?
Just in respect of the clauses, I think you're absolutely right, Ignacio, that the standard terms won't be changed anytime soon, because they only did them several years ago. But I do think that because the current situation is going to indelibly burn a scar on the whole of the industry for quite a long time, it's going to be in the minds of people of our kind of generation for a very long time. I suspect that as an immediate fallout, any contract entered into now will have some form of clarification on where the risk lies in respect of a pandemic type event. And I just think that in the short to medium term, I think it will be just a standard amendment that people will make. Employers will derive a standard COVID pandemic type clause that they will want in all of their contracts, I suspect. And contractors will also have a view on that. So I do think that even though, as you said, you kind of touched on the point earlier about this idea of, foreseeability, the idea of risk, is another event like this going to happen in another 100 years, 200 years, 5 years, who knows? But I think, you could, on that score, say, well, if we're looking at 1 in 100-year events, we could pick up every 1 in 100-year type event and have a specific clause about it. And obviously, we're not going to do that. But I think because it's left that much of a mark on people, I suspect that we will have, like I said, in 5, probably 10 years' time, people will still be using their own standard pandemic clauses that they have derived themselves. I don't know what you think on that, Luca.
I agree with Ignacio that FIDIC issue new suites every 20 years. So, we cannot wait other 20 years because I will be retired before looking at that. But, I do see that this pandemic issue struck the economy so much that, for instance, in certain important tender, after the first request for qualification document, they've issued an addendum to it depends, sometime to partially cover, say, COVID or epidemic issue. For instance, in a couple of important tender, quite a full protection already in case of COVID. So I think that notwithstanding standard format cannot be edited every time every year or whatever, this issue really struck the economy so much that there will be hopefully employer under the big pressure of even local contractor everywhere, association, they will hopefully they will amend, and they are doing that in the sense to cover COVID-19 and pandemic in general.
Luca, can I ask you a specific question about claiming over cost? So when I was doing some homework on this, I was looking in some detail at subclause 19.1 and 19.4 in terms of the cause of a force majeure. It seems to me still to be slightly ambiguous. Do you feel that there is an opportunity to claim over cost as a contractor in the case of COVID?
Because you mean that you can claim cost when the event occurs in the country, you cannot claim cost when the event occurs outside the country. Are you meaning that? I mean, it was complicated because, force majeure is not, epidemic is not in the list. The list obviously is including but not limited. It's not exhaustive list, but then it's a kind of, it's quite complicated for me to try to interpret in the sense that being the example of force majeure, giving entitlement to cost and time, being in the country, but also they are man-made, let's say, force majeure event like revolution, riot, that you can apply by analogy to an epidemic in the country. Was a very difficult interpretation and difficult to be understood from the client, and so we deviate and prefer to force and try to interpret to cost to clause 13.7 change in legislation. That was difficult. We investigate, but we come up that it was difficult to convince the client.
Yes. Ignacio, I'd like to sort of finish on a fairly positive note in terms of this discussion. And we talked a lot in the earlier sessions about pragmatism and collaboration and trying to resolve these issues that we've got, because nobody's at fault here, to take a very grown-up approach to this. Do you feel that the international construction community, you as I think you said you're a Spaniard who lives in England but is currently working in Spain, so you're probably the right person to come to this. We're in the right frame of mind.
I live in Paris, actually. I'm in Paris right now. Well, I think that there will be no other choice anyway. Even if employers or contractors don't want, they will have no choice, because eventually you need to finish the project. If you struggle the contractor, you will not finish the project. You will have to go for another one. It will be probably more costly. Also, from the contractor's perspective, if the employer is running out of money and you have to wait for your payments, maybe you cannot be very, very aggressive, because if not, you will not get paid. So whether they want to collaborate or not, it will be a necessity anyhow. But having said that, I've got an optimistic view. I think eventually, if the industry wants to survive, there will have to be collaboration. This is a big, big issue where everyone needs to help. So you can call it collaboration from the optimistic point of view or necessity. But the outcome should be that.
Thank you. Charles, I'll hand back to you to finish off on that question and just to finish the session off.
Yes, thanks, Phil. Just echoing Ignacio's points, I think he's made some very, very good ones there. And the issue of cash flow payment is super, super critical, obviously. It's something that was recognised in respect of the requirement to get cash flow through the supply chain, the lifeblood of the industry, which most people watching it will know from Lord Denning's remarks. In that you can only have a sustainable, robust construction industry if you have money flowing through from the top all the way down to the bottom. That's the only way it works. And that was the reason for the predominant reason for the introduction of adjudication in the UK, which, as I'm sure we're all aware, is a relatively fast turnaround dispute resolution process that effectively was geared to release cash through the supply chain. That's really what it was there for. And of course, we don't really have in the international market is that adjudication is used very widely in the UK. It's used more and more in certain other countries with links to the old UK, so Canada and Australia and South Africa and places like that. But in most other jurisdictions, and certainly from a statutory point of view, we don't have adjudication. So the way disputes are resolved in standard form is generally still the traditional arbitration or litigation, which is obviously a very slow kind of process and doesn't very well lend itself to payment disputes over an interim application, for example. Now, interestingly, the FIDIC contracts are making a move to help that a little bit. The 1999 versions have dispute avoidance boards, which can be utilized. Adjudication boards, which can be utilized, which is a kind of project-based quasi-adjudication procedure, which is a good move, and they are used quite frequently now in the international market. So there's clearly a move that way. FIDIC recognised the need for that need for kind of speedy resolution of these things. And also the 2017 version goes even further and has the option to have a dispute avoidance board, which is a much more upfront, collaborative, proactive way of two parties of construction. If they have a dispute, actually they get together, bang their heads together a little bit, get the dispute avoidance board to look at it and come up with a recommendation as to how the parties should deal with it. So this kind of way of thinking, this kind of collaborative approach, this kind of partnering approach, this very proactive, kind of grown-up approach, I think is absolutely what we need. We need more of it, and it's good that the FIDIC forms of contract are very much looking at progressing that forward as much as possible. They also have provision to very, very quickly finish off, and it's a point Ignacio pulled up again, it's under clause 2.4, the contractor can actually, if they're worried that the employer doesn't have the means to be able to pay them or provide cash through the payment process, then they can actually ask for the employer to provide proof that they can do that. And that's been enhanced a little bit under the 2017 version. I must say it's a pretty rare thing in my experience for a contractor actually to utilise that right, because it does tend to rub up the employers the wrong way. But I think if both parties come to it with the recognition that actually it's just for the project good, it's just for, because no one needs an employer that can't pay, and that's no good for the industry, for the project, or indeed for the contractors and supply chain. So I think there's been some really great points there, frankly. And I expected this, but the comments that we've had and the discussions we've had very much mirror the comments, the very positive comments that have come from the previous two discussions on, the NEC and JCT. So even though you have, three tenets of construction, very different, very similar in different ways, different forms of contracting, but obviously coalescing around the same key issues. And, what I've really picked up from the discussions that we've been having, both on this panel, on the previous panels, and obviously with the questions coming in, is very much that unless it's just that we are the only enlightened ones in the industry, you get the feel that actually, there's a real push, a real understanding across the industry, across the different sectors of construction, that actually, we do need to change. There are better ways to do things. We can come out the other side and we need to be stronger, more resilient and more sustainable. I think just harking back to the CLC document, which talks about the restart, the restate, and then the reinvent. Obviously, the restart kind of speaks for itself, and even the restate. But the reinvent is the very exciting one. That's the one that really kind of really gets me interested, because that's where we've got an opportunity as a sector, locally and worldwide, to create something a lot better. So not just get back to where we were, because frankly, where we were was not a brilliant position, certainly in the UK. But we can build something as a catalyst, something better than we had before. And I think that's got to be the push. It really, really has, because as Ignacio and Luca identified, there's the risk that we'll slide back into the traditional, well, contractors scrabbling to get money, and actually rather than the market driving good value, the need and requirement of contractors to get revenue and turnover is taken advantage of, not consciously but subconsciously, by the employer organisations, which then drives down costs, drives down quality, doesn't adequately deal with risk, and in the long run isn't really good for anyone. So just kind of not wanting to down a negative point, because I think it's been an amazingly, that's more of a warning than anything else. I think this has been a really good session, frankly. I think it's worked really, really well. It's been great being on the panel with Ignacio and Lucas. Thank you very much for joining us. And also the other three panels were great. Loads of interaction with the attendees, so that's been fantastic as well. Marvellously compared by Phil and Amanda, so thank you very much for that as well. So yeah, I don't think there's much more to say than that, but thank you everyone for being involved. It's been a real pleasure and honour.
Thank you very much, Charles, and it's been a pleasure working with HKA. Thank you. I'm just going to hand you back to Amanda, who's just going to say a few words by way of closing.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, Ignacio and Luca, for being on the panel today. And certainly, Luca, thank you for your persistence in joining the panel. And also, I wanted to thank our conference partners, Charles and HKA, for all their support with running the conference today. And I wanted to thank our national partners, Wilmot Dixon, Pagabo, International Fire Consultants, CLS, Frame, Perfect Circle, Cornerstone, New Former, and CIOB. We've got loads of online conferences coming up, so please go on our website and have a look at what's coming up in the next few months. Also, please continue to carry on with your networking, and the exhibitors are staying after this session, so please go and visit them. I know they've got lots of things to talk about. So on behalf of Built Environment Networking, thank you all for supporting us. I hope you've enjoyed the day, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.